So the summary here is that he won't be extradited, but he's been denied bail, and it seems completely illogical. But there's also a way that it makes sense. And I don't want to take too much time, but I'll just focus on what's illogical about it. And then maybe if you wanted to get into how it could make sense, I'll get to that. But it's not really a big deal if we don't go that route. I mean, obviously, everything along the way has been about tying this man up in legal limbo and making it impossible for him to be the editor-in-chief of WikiLeaks organization, to effectively do the type of things that Ed was talking about here that have always been the objectives of WikiLeaks. But the judge, so on Monday, on January 4th, she ruled that the request must be denied because if Julian Assange was extradited to the United States, there's a high likelihood that he would be sent to ADX Florence, Colorado, which is a supermax prison. And there he would be placed under something called special administrative measures. And he would be put in not just solitary confinement, it's like solitary confinement plus, because you're even more restricted and cut off from the world and who you're able to speak with and the kind of mail you're able to receive, etc. And in there, he would be so committed because of his mental health issues, because he has a recurring depressive disorder, because he's also on the autism spectrum. He is likely to find a way, because he is a committed man, and he's also talked about it in Belmarsh. He's talked about ending his life. He's reached out to something called the Samaritan's phone, which is it's a service that you can call when you're considering suicide. He's made arrangements. He drafted a will while he was in Belmarsh. And so the idea is that no matter what, the prison would fail to prevent Julian Assange from killing himself. And so the judge decided that he should not be extradited to the United States. She endorsed 95% of anything she ever heard out of the Crown Prosecution Service that was representing the U.S. government. She believed all the allegations against Julian Assange, that he's not a journalist, which I don't agree with, and everything that was said about WikiLeaks being a criminal enterprise that's only in the business of hacking. That's what she agreed with. But she saw that the U.S. mass incarceration system is just inherently cruel and inhumane, and this is what would happen, and so he couldn't be extradited. And it's actually not the first of its kind case, because this has happened in two other cases with people who were accused of hacking offenses, Lori Love and Gary McKinnon, who were accused of very, very severe charges. They were hit with very intense, they could have done a long time in U.S. prisons if they had been brought to the United States for trial. But they beat their extradition cases. It took like a decade to win them, but they won. So then today, on Wednesday, we all thought there was a good chance, because it all revolved around the mental health of Julian Assange. We all believed that there was a good chance that he would be set free, but yet clearly it would seem Vanessa Baraitser is serving higher institutions of power and decided to prevent Julian Assange from leaving the Belmarsh prison, even though the pandemic is just ripping through London right now. They're on lockdown. There's an outbreak in Julian's prison unit, and even though he offered to put a GPS, this might be of interest to Ed because he does tech stuff. They offered to put a tracking device on him and go on house arrest. And at no point was there any requirement or did at any time did we get any reasoning from the judge as to what she thinks he's going to do in order to try and flee London with this, even though he's going to have this device on his life. She doesn't tell us how he's going to escape. And so he was denied. She believed that he was going to try and use his support networks to potentially leave London because WikiLeaks helped Edward Snowden, NSA whistleblower Edward Snowden, get from Hong Kong. They were trying to get him to Ecuador, but he ended up stuck in the Moscow airport after the State Department revoked his passport. But because of that, that was counted against him. They really believe that he would try to enter an embassy again, even though that doesn't make any sense because he now has a family and he would like to move on with his life and be with his children and his fiance. But and who wants to repeat the horror of being in the Ecuador embassy? That was absolute hell. And eventually they turned on him because the politics changed in Ecuador, and then he was expelled. And so that could easily happen all over again if you entered a country's embassy.
Yeah. And then do you think that was like to prevent him from being martyred? Like she wanted to buy him some time?
No, I think it's because, so like when I cover this case, I think about the person who's being charged and why they shouldn't be facing political prosecution. But Vanessa Baraitser thinks about Vanessa Baraitser, and she only cares about what's going to happen to her in her career. And the reason why she ruled in this manner and why it doesn't make sense, but it makes complete sense if you make this all about the judge, is because she didn't want to be responsible if something happened to Julian Assange in the United States. So what does she do? She gives a decision that she knows the U.S. government will immediately appeal, and it goes up to the High Court of Justice next. And then if the High Court of Justice rules and they decide that she was wrong, she's perfectly happy with that, because in that case, she's not going to be responsible if something happens to Julian Assange. She's not the one that ruled in favor of the U.S. government and allowed him to be extradited to the United States. So then now it becomes the High Court of Justice that would have blood on their hands, not Vanessa Baraitser. So she only cares about herself. She just doesn't want to have this follow her for the rest of her career, because nobody knows Vanessa Baraitser until Julian Assange becomes a defendant that's before her and facing extradition to the United States. You know, you didn't hear about him. Ed didn't hear about him. Leslie's never heard about Vanessa. I never heard about Vanessa. Nobody in the world knows who this judge is in the United Kingdom. And I think her concern is that she's going to go down in history as the judge who was involved in the extradition case against Julian Assange. And it's going to reflect poorly on her because there's a lot of worldwide support for Assange and WikiLeaks. The human rights organizations support him, and then press freedom organizations have been sounding the alarm. In Europe, there are even parliamentarians in Germany and parts of Spain and Italy and other parts of Europe. I didn't go to any of the countries on the African continent and throughout Latin America. There's support throughout the world for Julian Assange and WikiLeaks. And she knows that, they would always see her as the villain if Julian Assange killed himself in a U.S. prison. So she's just punting. It's her not wanting to take responsibility and not be held accountable for making a decision.
I mean, that's what I meant that in combination with when I said it doesn't want him to become a martyr, I meant like for her ass as well.
Yes.
But but that makes sense also for,
That's my read. That's my theory. And that's why it doesn't look like it makes sense, but it actually makes sense.
It does, yeah.
You think of it from that angle. Because then it's consistent. Because, then it's not really about mental health. Because if it's about mental health, he wouldn't be in prison tonight. Right. I wouldn't be talking to you. He would be actually on house arrest, awaiting the ultimate outcome of his appeal, which we don't, just for the record, we don't have a date for that yet. We don't know what's going to happen. And I will say, for those who are listening and it sounds bleak, that, and maybe we could collectively laugh about this, because I have. I find the dark humor, at least, maybe it's not that dark, but the fact that the U.S. government is going to have to go before this High Court of Justice and convince the three judge panel that the U.S. incarceration system is not cruel and inhumane. That's essentially what they have to prove in order to win their appeal, because that's what the judge rules. And I mean that because the judge didn't rule against their criminal allegations. The judge believes that all of those have substance. So that's not what the appeal is going to be about. When they go to court, they aren't going to have to defend bringing a case against Julian Assange. What they're going to have to prove is that the system wouldn't result in Julian Assange's death because of his psychological torture that he's experienced.
Right. Yeah. Was it you who tweeted this out? Like the criminal justice is like brutality just saved Julian Assange. What was it?
I put it this way, that the U.S. government, that the U.S. mass incarceration system just lost the U.S. government their case against Julian Assange.
Yeah.
Because if you listen to the judge, I mean, at least I was, I mean, she went on for about 40 minutes. The entire ruling that she gives was entirely predictable. It's exactly what I was prepared for. I thought that she was going to extradite him. And then all of a sudden it takes this weird turn, very surreal turn as she's speaking. And she starts to care about where he's going to end up if he's imprisoned after trial. And she starts to care that we have this thing that has been written about by Center for Constitutional Rights and other human rights attorneys. And there's special administrative measures, as I said. And she really emphasizes the nightmare that he would go through. And then she says, I cannot extradite him because it would be oppressive for mental health reasons. And I mean, that was just, and I think the most stunning thing, where I actually tweeted, holy shit, was when she said, I am satisfied that if Julian Assange was extradited to the United States, he would try to, he would not be stopped from committing suicide.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, they would likely put him, like you said, solitary confinement plus, and do, I mean, do you remember when they had
Chelsea Manning?
Chelsea Manning. They also had a recent, I think it was a leak of like Ghislaine Maxwell, where they put her on suicide watch, but their suicide watch was like waking her up every few hours, preventing sleep in the first place. You know, which in of itself is a tactic that has been, has been used, sleep deprivation for torture. Yeah, and so solitary confinement is already torture in of itself. Right. You know, I can't imagine. I have no idea how they'd be able to convince the court of that, because they would put him in solitary. There's no way in hell they wouldn't, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and with Chelsea Manning, they did that with her, right? When she was suicidal.
Yep. Yeah, they kept waking her up. Check. You do it's like a wellness check every 15 minutes. They come and you have to say something back. And you do this during the middle of the night. They come by and it's like 3 a.m. in the morning and they wake you up. Everything okay in there? Yeah. Well, I'm trying to sleep. Like, actually, I want to say that just I sometimes I forget, sometimes I don't. I always want to like fit in Chelsea in this because I think her courage actually is something in which Julian Assange will always have a kind of debt to her because of what she's done. I mean, I don't have to go on very long, but her suicide attempt at the Alexandria Detention Center, which happened because she was subpoenaed to testify before a grand jury against WikiLeaks, is referenced in the judge's extradition decision as part of the reason why Julian Assange could not be extradited and be guaranteed to live if he was, to survive. I mean, that he would actually make this suicide attempt and the facility would not stop him because, the Alexandria Detention Center didn't stop Chelsea Manning from trying to kill herself. And so I just find that really amazing to me because in the end, it's the U.S. government's overzealousness to drag Chelsea Manning before a grand jury to try to force her so she's a source, to turn a source who had already been prosecuted and then had clemency, to turn a source against a publisher. And because they wanted to make her their star witness that could be used to nail Julian Assange, and she stood up to them and resisted them for a year and then was finally let out of jail as the pandemic was hitting the United States last year. Because she stood up to the U.S. government, it seems to me that Julian Assange is not going to be extradited because she resisted the U.S. government.
Yeah.
But he's also been denied bail, right? So the next thing is just wait to see if the United States appeals this.
So I mean, that's the unfortunate thing is that he sits there right now while COVID rips through the prison. He sits there under stress. I mean, her own rule. This is the thing that doesn't make sense. Her own ruling says that Julian Assange isn't telling his doctors about the sort of mental health issues he's having, because he's afraid that if he said something, they would put him under constant watch, the kind of thing that we were just talking about here. And that would be torture in and of itself. So he goes in there and will hide some of the things that are ailing him from his own doctors. And so that is referenced in there as a reason why Julian Assange would be in trouble in the United States. But I think what's really wild is she holds up this UK high security prison that's sort of viewed as like a British Gitmo kind of a place. And she makes it out to be like this shiny example of how prisons should be for people. And yet Julian Assange has gone through a lot of distress and anguish during this time. In fact, he had a friend who committed suicide in the facility. It was a gay man who he enjoyed. This was a tenor singer, someone that he enjoyed hearing their voice in the cell nearby him. And he killed himself because he was about to be deported by the UK government to Jair Bolsonaro's Brazil. And he knew that if he was returned, he would probably face persecution. So, to me, that doesn't scream a shining example of a prison that everyone should aspire to be. Now, it does have some services that we know that individual prisoners in the United States would never get, but still, there are things that are happening there. He's had to fight to get blankets or warm clothing brought to him during the winter because there's not proper heating inside of Belmarsh. So these are standard run-of-the-mill issues you hear about for people who are incarcerated. But I would say if that's something that's going on in that facility, you can't hold it up as an example to the world as what it should be.
Yeah, it's awful.